Have you ever felt that sudden icy chill on the back of your neck when you're completely alone in your room? You tell yourself it's just the AC or a draft from the window. You check your phone, scroll through social media, trying to drown out the silence. But deep down, you know something is wrong. What if I told you that the silence isn't empty? What if the shadows in the corner of your room aren't just tricks of the light, but something waiting for you to look away? Tonight's story is about Rohan, an ordinary college student who thought his apartment was just a bit old. He didn't believe in ghosts, but by the time the clock struck midnight, he realized that some lease agreements are signed in blood. Rohan was thrilled when he found the apartment. It was a spacious, semi-furnished flat on the 4th floor of an old building, tucked away in a quiet corner of the city. The rent was ridiculously cheap, almost too cheap for a college student on a budget. When he asked the landlord, a frail old man with hollow eyes, why the rent was so low, the man simply shrugged. People these days prefer modern buildings, beta. This place is old. It has character. Rohan didn't care about character. He cared about his wallet. He moved his bags in on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. The apartment smelled of old paper and damp wood. In the living room, there was a large, antique grandfather clock. Its wood was dark, almost black, and the pendulum swung back and forth with a heavy, rhythmic sound. The landlord noticed Rohan staring at it. "Ah, the clock," the old man whispered. "It doesn't work perfectly. Sometimes it stops. But whatever you do, never try to change the time manually. Just let it be." Rohan nodded, thinking it was just an old man's superstition. He was just glad to have his own space. The first few days went smoothly. Rohan set up his laptop, arranged his books, and got into a routine. But by Friday, the weather turned terrible. A massive thunderstorm hit the city, cutting off the electricity. The apartment plunged into pitch-black darkness. The only light came from the occasional flash of lightning outside the window, casting long, distorted shadows across the living room. Rohan sighed, turning on his phone's flashlight. He sat on his bed, trying to study, but the atmosphere felt heavy. The air was freezing, far colder than it should have been during a summer storm. And then he noticed the silence. The grandfather clock had stopped. The pendulum was perfectly still, pointing dead center. Rohan glanced at his phone. The time was 11:45 p.m. Suddenly, he heard a sound. It wasn't the thunder. It was a soft, rhythmic scratching noise. It sounded like fingernails scraping against concrete. Rohan froze. He held his breath, listening intently. The sound wasn't coming from outside. It was coming from inside the wall, right behind his bed. "Must be rats," Rohan muttered aloud, his voice sounding thin and weak in the dark. But rats don't scratch in a rhythm. Scratch, scratch, scratch. It sounded deliberate, like someone trying to get his attention. Trying to ignore the sound, Rohan got up to get a glass of water. He walked into the kitchen, using his phone's light to guide him. As he poured the water, the scratching stopped. The sudden silence was even more terrifying. He turned around to walk back to his bedroom, flashing his phone light across the hallway. The light passed over the large mirror hanging near the entrance. Rohan stopped dead in his tracks. In the brief second the light hit the mirror, he saw something. He slowly turned the flashlight back toward the glass. The reflection showed the hallway. It showed Rohan holding his phone. But in the reflection, there was a silhouette of a tall, emaciated figure standing right behind him. Its head was tilted at an unnatural, broken angle. Rohan's heart, hammered against his ribs. He spun around instantly, flashing the light behind him. Nothing. The hallway was completely empty. His hands shaking, he looked back at the mirror. In the reflection, the figure was gone. Rohan gasped for air, his forehead covered in cold sweat. "I'm losing my mind," he whispered to himself. "It's just the stress, the shadows." He rushed back to his bedroom, slammed the door shut, and locked it. Rohan sat on his bed, clutching his blanket. He kept his eyes glued to the bottom of the bedroom door, terrified that he would see a shadow block the faint light coming from the window. He looked at his phone again. 11:59 p.m. The air in the room grew so cold that he could see his own breath forming white mist in the air. Then, from the living room, a sound broke the silence. Bong, the grandfather clock. It had started working again on its own. Bong, it was striking midnight. Rohan counted the chimes, each one echoing through the empty apartment like a death knell. Bong, bong, bong. On the 7th chime, Rohan heard another sound. It was the sound of his front door slowly creaking open. Rohan's blood ran cold. He knew he had locked the main door. He distinctly remembered turning the key. Bong, bong, bong. Now there were footsteps. Slow, heavy, dragging footsteps walking into the living room. Thud, drag, thud, drag. Rohan wanted to scream, but no sound came out of his throat. Fear had completely paralyzed him. Bong, bong, bong. The 11th chime. The dragging footsteps were now right outside his bedroom door. Bong. The 12th chime. Silence fell over the apartment once again. The clock stopped. The footsteps stopped. Rohan stared at the gap under his bedroom door. In the dim light of the lightning, he saw two pale, decayed, bloodless feet standing right outside. The doorknob began to turn. Slow, deliberate. Click. The door slowly swung open. Rohan closed his eyes tight, too terrified to look. He began to pray, tears streaming down his face. "Please, go away. Please." Rohan, a voice whispered his name. It didn't sound like a monster. It sounded like a tired, terrified old man. Rohan opened his eyes just a crack. Standing in the doorway wasn't a demon. It was his landlord. The old man was holding a candle, his face pale as a sheet, shaking uncontrollably. "Rohan, you have to leave. Now," the landlord whispered, his voice trembling. Rohan was confused. "Uncle, how did you get in? What is happening?" The old man stepped into the room, but as the candlelight flickered, Rohan noticed something horrifying. The old man's feet weren't touching the ground. He was levitating 3 inches above the floor, and around his neck was a thick, dark bruise, the unmistakable mark of a hanging rope. "I tried to warn you," the old man's spirit whispered, his eyes filling with black fluid. "I told you never to touch the clock. I changed the time manually 40 years ago tonight, and it never let me leave." Suddenly, the old man's expression turned from terror to pure horror. He looked past Rohan, right at the wall behind the bed. "It's behind you," the landlord screamed. Before Rohan could turn around, 2 icy skeletal hands shot out from the solid concrete wall behind his bed. The fingers were long, with sharp, blackened nails. They gripped Rohan's shoulders with impossible, crushing strength. The temperature in the room dropped to absolute zero. Rohan tried to scream, but the air was sucked right out of his lungs. He looked at his phone one last time as it slipped from his numb fingers. The time on the screen didn't say 12:01 a.m. The digital clock on his phone was spinning backward rapidly. 11:58, 11:55, 11:30. The entity in the wall was pulling him backward, dragging his body into the solid concrete. Rohan looked at the doorway, but the landlord's spirit had vanished. He was entirely alone. As his torso was pulled into the freezing darkness of the wall, he heard a voice in his ear, a raspy, deep laugh that sounded like grinding stones. Welcome to the midnight. The next morning, the storm had passed. The sun was shining bright. The real estate agent arrived at the apartment with a young couple looking for a cheap place to rent. The apartment was clean, empty, and smelled of old wood. In the living room, the grandfather clock was ticking perfectly. Tick, tock, tick, tock. It's a beautiful place, the young woman said, smiling. But why is the rent so low? The agent smiled smoothly. Oh, the previous tenant moved out suddenly last night. Left all his books and clothes behind. Guess he couldn't handle the city life. As the couple walked into the bedroom, they didn't notice the faint dark stain on the concrete wall behind the bed. A stain that looked exactly like the silhouette of a young man, frozen in a scream. So the next time you find an apartment that's a little too cheap, or the next time you hear a scratching sound in your wall at night, don't look at the clock, because some seconds might be your last.